I feel privileged to meet with you guys here today and share a little bit of what we've learned about this coming tidal wave that at least they keep saying it's coming, called CMMC. Let me get my share moving forward here. Excuse me just a second here.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, did I share the right thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. Good, thank you. So as you're probably aware, the Department of Defense is rolling out a requirement for all 300,000 defense contractors that support defense projects, and whether that's hardware, software, services, doesn't matter. If you not only are a contractor to the government, but a sub to a prime, or a sub to a sub to a prime, or you're 8 levels down in the pecking order there, CMMC will be a requirement, because it requires the regulation to be flowed down through the contracts to all levels within CMMC. And CMMC stands for the controlled, or stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. You get a little flavor that the folks behind CMMI were somehow behind CMMC, if for no other reason the acronyms are similar, but that's actually true, that Carnegie Mellon was part of the team that wrote these standards. So we're kind of in the pre-market early phases of this thing right now, but when it hits, it's going to hit every one of these customers, at least we think of them as customers, companies that service the federal government on the defense side. There's also an expectation that the other parts of the government are watching what happens in defense to see if they may want to model further certifications around cybersecurity in the future. So it's a big deal, and they've been working on it now for years. They originally were planning to release it 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I guess. And then when administrations changed, that's all I'm going to say about that. There was a review, and it's now resulted in a 3.5-year delay at this point. But they're trying to get this pushed out the door by the end of this year, and you can imagine why that is. Because we might be facing another we are facing another administration change, right? So so these things change, and as the government's involved, it affects everyone. But we really believe that CMMC is an important part of national security, because our adversaries don't try to hack the DoD's servers per se, or go after even prime contractors for the most part. They wait until drawings and specifications and test plans flow out through the supply chain and gobble them up off these smaller networks, and piece them back together. And was it the F-35, Rick? That's the fighter jet that was the quintessential example of when, what was it, 2 years after the F-35 was released, overseas, we had an identical airplane coming out with a different national logo on it, and they didn't, you can't imagine that they did their own engineering work on this thing. So, and as they peeled back that issue, they found that the pilfering was done at the supplier level, and then reverse engineered back into an overall system. So that's obviously a very obvious or public example of the kinds of intellectual property issues that the federal government is facing. So CMMC is all about protecting government documents, government drawings, government or related to the government. So if there's information that's being exchanged through the supply chain regarding a defense contract, any information regarding a defense contract, it can only be transmitted to a company on a network that is CMMC certified. Now I'm talking as if it's done, but it's not done. But fast forward 7 years, and that should be the case. So and there are certification levels involved. If you're familiar with CMMI, you're used to the levels thing. There are 3 levels in CMMC 2.0. Today we're going to focus mostly on CMMC level 2, the one in the middle, because it is the protection for technical documentation. Level 1 is just for contract information. I say just. It's important to keep that safe. But level 1 doesn't even hold a candle to level 2 in terms of complexity and the impact on small businesses that are really going to be affected. So today's session, we're going to talk about scoping, which is a component of preparing for CMMC. And we labeled this strategic consulting because the decision about scope, and we'll explain that term in a minute, can literally make or break an initiative to get certified. In other words, do we take a broad scope or a narrow scope? And you can imagine, this is pretty logical, a broad scope is going to cost more time and money than a narrow scope. But a lot of businesses don't know there are options. So, or that this is even a consideration to be able to try to minimize the cost by reducing scope. So we're going to talk about how a business, where it would fit, it doesn't always fit, but where it would fit, they might be able to take advantage of a narrower scope. So, I want you to kind of envision this as a company's network. I know it's a pretty poor drawing, but let's pretend. And this is a network diagram, and the point is that when controlled unclassified information, or CUI, and sometimes you'll hear it pronounced CUI, I just refuse to do it. I'm going to go with the letters. But when a company is the recipient of controlled unclassified information, technical drawings, let's just use that as the example, then that network is a potential target for an adversary that wants to get their hands on the CUI. So that network, the scope of protection, the bubble of protection, if you will, the scope of protection in this simple example would be that any part of that network, whether on-premise or in the cloud, any part of that network could be subject to an attack. And any part of that network could be an avenue for theft of CUI. So if a company is going to take a more comprehensive view of the security and certification requirements, they might say, well, we're receiving CUI, our drawings and technical specs are all over our network. Most anybody can get access to them because we're not that careful. We email the drawings around to each other, so it's in everybody's email account, et cetera, et cetera. Then we better just throw the umbrella around the whole thing and protect it. And so then they start down the path of trying to upgrade their network, get it secure, meet the requirements, because there's all these different requirements. No, you can't read that. I didn't mean for you to. But all these different requirements, and in fact, in the CMMC requirements, which are spelled out for the most part in a NIST standard, SP 800-171, there are 110 itemized security controls that a company has to meet to be CMMC level 2 certified, 110. Well, it's not that simple, because you multiply the 110 times the instructions for the assessors. So there's another manual you go to get to the assessor's view of all this. And that breaks the 110 down to 320 different components. So there are actually 320 criteria, I'm going to put it that way, that a company is going to have to deal with and show compliance to in order to get certified. And this is an all or nothing deal. You either have 320 satisfied controls, or you have 319 and you don't get certified. So that's the position that the regulation has in it right now. And there are no open items following an assessment. I think there might be some leeway on that, Rick, now, but not much. The simpler things you might be able to have some leeway on. The complicated technical things, you'd better have them nailed. So you can imagine if we had, I don't know, 150 devices in our network, just picking a number out of the air, times 320 criteria, you're in over your head real fast. So scoping where you're going to keep that CUI and where you're going to protect it, and what aspect are you going to certify your entire network. How are you going to learn all this stuff? That's a big question. How are you going to pay for all this stuff? That's a big question, especially for senior management who wants to know, is this even worth it? And I guarantee you that is a question that is flowing all over the defense industry right now. Is this thing going to be worth it? If I only have one defense contract out of my whole business, I do one small project on one defense contract, am I going to spend the time and money to get certified for that? Well, the next question is, how much is it going to cost me? Well, I'm just trying to illustrate that the more complex the environment and the more broad the scope, the more expensive this gets, and the more difficult it gets. And so this is it especially is going to land on the vast majority of defense contractors that are small businesses. And that's a true statement. So all 110 and the 320 have to be fully met. So Rick, so what do we really mean by scope? Can you break that down a little bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. The scope is looking at the boundaries that are put in place for the assessment. The smaller the boundary, the less expensive the assessment theoretically should be, the less effort you have. So the scope, the boundaries of the scope addresses devices, people, what all are the things that would interact with CUI. So if we can make that boundary small, we can reduce our effort, we can reduce our amount of time there, the cost involved, even the assessment itself, we can shrink that down. So, it involves your routers and your, switches and your computers, any device that you would have on your network, your physical location, the people there. So it covers a whole broad spectrum that would be accessible or auditable. They hate the word audit, but that's what we're talking about, the assessment process.
Yeah. And Rick, that would include any cloud-based systems that might be connected into your network, right?
Absolutely.
So if I'll just throw an example out there. If you're using 365 as your environment, for communications and documents and such, your 365 account is in scope. Even though you don't host it, even though you don't manage it. So this thing can get complex fast. And I guess have a particular fondness or a soft spot for the smaller companies that don't have the kind of technical resources that they might need to not only to do all of this, but to even understand all of this and then pay for it. I'd hate to see a lot of really good small businesses that, by the way, a lot of innovation that benefits our warfighters comes out of small business. I mean, there's a ton of innovation, but so if a lot of small businesses leave over this or can't get certified because of these requirements, that's really could affect, another aspect of our warfighting capabilities. So that's definitely what's at stake. So Rick, let's start to break down what steps one might go through to get their arms around this issue of scope.
Yeah, good question. The very first step that you want to take is to understand the requirements. If you don't understand the requirements, you really don't know what all you have to include in your scope. So there are key documents or requirements. They're called the DFARS requirements. They are the regulations, the 252, 204, 7012, 7019, 7020, 7021. These are the regulations that guide this identifying your scope. In particular, as Scott mentioned earlier, is the NIST 800-171 Rev 2, which is part of the DFAR 7012. And that gives you the 110 requirements that Scott was talking about that you need to meet. And then there's the other document, the 171A. Those are the assessment objectives, that 320 requirements or objectives that need to be met. So I like to look at it from a perspective that you have your 110, and then they break those 110 down into the assessment objectives, kind of like you would do in an English class when you diagram a sentence. So that's what they've done, but you have to have an artifact or an example for every one of those 320 assessment objectives. So once again, keeping that scope small is going to be important. There's other resources. As you can see up here, you have your scoping guidances for level 1 and level 2 that soon, hopefully, will be released. You have your assessment guides. You have the CUI registry from the DoD. All those things, understanding what these requirements are, will help you understand, okay, what is my scope? Can I keep that scope as small as possible? And then there is that training aspect and consulting options that you need to understand and have that assistance, because once again, some of the language at the DoD isn't very intuitive, and you may need some help navigating through their language, if you will.
Yeah, and I think we just took a sampling of the documents that are kind of associated with DFARS compliance and CMMC certification. I think in total, there's maybe 20 or 25 documents that this references this, and this is built on that. And if you follow the chains down through those trees, it's a lot. And but if you got to understand, if you don't understand what they're asking for, you really have no shot. If you guys have been through any certifications in the past, you know exactly what we're talking about. So let's presume for a moment, we fast forward, we've done our homework, we've learned the requirements, then it's about identifying the controlled unclassified information. Now, you would think that it would all just be conveniently marked or color-coded, and you'd know all the blue ones are CUI, protect the blue ones, or whatever. Well, I think the CUI regulations have been floating through the federal government longer than certainly CMMC, if not DFARS. They've been around for a long time. That is a government-wide initiative, not just a Defense Department initiative, to mark all the documentation and information that the federal government produces that they consider sensitive. Not necessarily, we're not talking about classified programs. Okay, we're going to take that, set it aside, because this isn't for that. This is for unclassified documentation. But some of that information, we want to keep it secure. You would think it would be marked. It's not marked. I mean, there's some here and there are guidelines for how you're supposed to mark it. There are regulations that you're supposed to mark it, but it's not marked. And so it requires go looking at the directory Rick mentioned and doing some reverse engineering and some guesswork to try to figure out if this particular document in my hand is going to be one of those that the assessor is going to ask me, how is that thing protected because it's CUI? Well, there's another very subjective component here. Our thought is to help companies kind of sort through this quagmire is start with what customers or contracts do you have related to the defense and that are going to require CMMC. So if it's defense related at any level in the chain, if the product or service you provide is going to end up in a defense use case, I guess we'll say, then that's kind of checkbox number one. Secondly, what is the specific kind of documentation we send and receive or produce, by the way, because it could be you're an engineering company and you produce documents, that's going to qualify as CUI, and that's where the directory can help and some other types of things. But it doesn't clear up the gray, I will tell you that. So let's presume we put our arms around, we have these 3 government contracts, and we put we have our documents that, you know, we have some drawings and some test plans and some reports and some software specs and other kinds of things that we have as part of servicing those contracts. The next question would be, you know, what's the flow of that documentation through our organization? So where does it start? Where does it go? Where does it land? How is it maintained? Where is it backed up? Is it ever printed? Where do those printed copies go? Do we ever send it external? Who do we send it to? That's this information flow or data flow that can kind of help. I'll tell you, I've done a couple of those and they're just spaghetti. It's just like a pile of spaghetti and you're trying to map it all out because most companies aren't very disciplined about how documentation flows within their organization. So I know we're layering complexity upon complexity, but that's just what the nature of this thing really is. But so now our advice to customers with the plate of spaghetti, trying to figure out what we need to protect, what we don't, what's CUI, what's not CUI. Just consider the whole plate CUI. Just treat everything related to your Northrop project as CUI. Treat everything related to your Boeing contract as CUI, whatever it is. Just, you can take a broader, you know, you can protect more than you need to, but if you say, let's protect everything related to that contract as if it's CUI, I guess that's the safe than sorry kind of approach to it. All right, so we've kind of, you know, looked at the requirements and we've looked at documentation, and then we look at what's called assets. So now as Rick mentioned, there's a lot of things and people and systems and software involved in any system. And some of that is more directly related to security and protection, and some isn't related at all to security and protection of CUI. So they've defined 5 levels of assets, from those that definitely process, store, or transmit CUI. So if I have a laptop and I receive CUI on it because I'm in sales or I'm in engineering, then guess what? That laptop is in scope. It is a CUI asset, period. So there are going to be rules for how you protect that device. Now that could also be a person, could be an individual. The engineer who uses the laptop would be considered a CUI asset. So kind of think of it broadly in that regard. Then there are components of a system or a network that help to protect the network. They're not necessarily where the CUI is going to reside or be viewed or printed, but it's all the, you know, networking equipment and firewalls and other kinds of and a lot of software systems, like a SIM system or or other kind of capabilities, those would be considered security protection assets. So there are rules about that. Then there are those that are connected to your network. So they're in the environment, but they're not intended. You don't plan to have CUI on them. Well, that doesn't make them, impervious to assault. It still can have an attack through that door. But there are, rules for how risk managed assets are handled. And then there are devices, perhaps, let's use an example of IoT device, maybe a printer or something, or a manufacturing piece of equipment where you got to get the software or the program downloaded out to your CNC machine or whatever. And some of that equipment is not built to be secured in today's standards. Some equipment out of manufacturing is still operating with Windows XP. I'm just saying. There's no way, no how that could be brought up to code, let's say. So there are those, they're going to call those specialized assets. So you got to have a plan for how you're going to deal with those. And then you got those that just aren't connected in any way. And those are out of scope. So as you could imagine, the more devices, the more narrow our scope, the more devices are going to fall into the lower levels here, and the less, I guess, trouble it's going to be to. But you do need to make an inventory of your assets, and you need to classify them, and that would be part of the assessment. So if your eyes haven't started to roll yet, we'll turn it back over to Rick and talk about what I didn't talk much about is what about laptops and PCs in particular? What are those? Are those protected or not protected, in scope, out of scope? What are they?
Well, yeah, laptops, we use a statement, it depends. If you hate that statement, I understand that. So a laptop can be considered a CUI asset because it accesses CUI, it manipulates information. You access prints or data or requirements. All that flowing through that laptop would make that a CUI asset. You also have, it can fit into the category of a security protected asset in that there's hosted security applications and tools that would be run on that particular laptop or PC. So it could fit into that category.
Or server, Rick. Let me broaden that out just a little bit.
Or
It could be a server as well. Yeah.
it could be a server, yes.
Yeah.
Any device like that, computing device. It could be a tablet. It could be any number of devices like that. Then you have the contractor risk management. It could be that there could be certain policies in place that would prevent this device from handling CUI. That would put it into that category. Or if the laptop is not going to be used to touch CUI, then we would look at that as being out of scope. The other one is special assets. Maybe those, it's kind of like what Scott was saying, that they are so far out of date. They're using an operating system that you can't protect by normal means. So it's a special asset that we're controlling the environment that device is in order to provide a proper level of security. So once again, a laptop could fit into any one of those categories. So it just depends how we're using it, what it's used for, and it extends beyond just the laptop or the desktop. It could be servers, it could be portable devices, any kind of computing piece of equipment.
So Rick, talk a little bit about then the way we need to document all these assets. What is the assessor, what would we have to produce for an assessor from a documentation perspective?
Well, yeah, so you definitely want to create an asset inventory list. That is a list of all of the devices or items that we talked about in those categories. And it needs to be a comprehensive list where we're identifying all the various components that would be interacting with CUI. And keep in mind, we're talking about those things that interact with that CUI that control unclassified information. Anything else is out of scope. So we're going back to that scoping question. Make sure we identify that scope. Your SSP, your system security plan, it's important to have that document what's in scope and what's out of scope. It will list your assets that you would have that interact there, as well as your network diagram. Scott showed a little bit about that earlier. We want to understand the relationship between all those connection of devices, those assets that are in scope, whether it's a device, whether it's a person. Another aspect of that is a data flow diagram showing how does our data flow within our network. So all those things are important for determining and helping us identify what those assets are that can be assessed by a CMMC assessor.
Yeah, and then that brings us then to kind of the boundary scoping part of this process. So as an organization thinks about what's included in our scope, they look through the asset list, determine, what needs to be protected, what's part of it, where is all this equipment residing, where is it all accessed and utilized. So there's physical security measures that are pertinent as well. And then, doing some double checking that you can't access from outside that CUI from outside the boundaries. So you'd want to do some security checks and things like that, just to test your boundary concept. And then the final step would be then review and validate. It would be near and dear to you guys' heart, I know, but verify that you've properly established your scope. So let's presume for the moment you've gone through these steps. You can imagine this could take weeks or months to do, just to be comprehensive and detailed enough. By the time you start at the beginning, where you're just learning the requirements, to studying your environment, if you have the IT chops to do it. I don't. I couldn't evaluate my network because I'm not an IT guy. So I'd have to get, someone who's much more knowledgeable in that regard, get them up to speed, all of that kind of thing. And again, small companies just don't have these kind of people and resources to do these kind of things. So then it brings the question of how could we limit the scope? What's the approach? And again, we're back to that question of strategy. So one way to do it is the whole enchilada, or the whole plate of spaghetti. Sorry, I changed foods on you. You can tell it's almost dinner time, so I'm starting to think about food. But include everything. Include all your entire network. You have one network, you have one boundary now, you have one IT environment that you manage. You have maybe an MSP that takes care of all this equipment, and we don't want to think about it any harder than that. We're just going to include the whole thing. Now, that also would be, a legitimate way to go if majority of your business is with the Defense Department and you want to keep those contracts. Well, it's going to be hard to segregate and narrow it down. You may need everyone to have access, and you may need every device to be in scope. In that case, then you would have a strategy of your entire network. But you could also segregate off a portion of your network to create an internal enclave or segregated area through a subnet or some other kind of a technique. But you've got to have IT expertise to pull that off and ensure that those boundaries are established clearly. But in that case, you might say, well, we only need these 4 people, not our whole company. We only need these 4 people to have access. Can we create a subnet, an enclave for that CUI to live, and we're going to make a rule that no one ever sends the CUI outside of that. I mean, the rules are rules, but you'd want to try to protect all that. But that's an approach. It's a legitimate approach to take, and you can envision the cost and complexity goes down. And then the third is to punt the whole thing down the road to an external provider who's going to provide an enclave that's in the cloud, and they're already set up for CMMC. So you don't have any upgrades. You don't have any investigation. You don't have any inventories to make. You can say, I'm going to hire somebody who's already specialized there, and they have a system, and there are several providers that provide external enclaves for CMMC. So I'm just trying to lay out, and there may be hybrid solutions this is kind of just a rough cut of different approaches that you can take. Now, as we've said, small businesses don't have a ton of resources, Rick, right?
That's right. That's right. So, most small businesses, they're faced with, having outdated security protocols. They lack the ability to scale up, if you will, because once again, we mentioned a little earlier, if we're going to put an entire network into scope, there is going to be expense for equipment, updating all that equipment. It's going to be time consuming. And I think the biggest problem here is the IT staff and resources. Most small companies do not have cybersecurity experts on staff. They may have someone that can, install a printer, but they certainly do not know how to protect an entire network from the various entities, from the firewall through the antivirus. We talked about a SIM product monitoring all activity that's happening on your network. So many times you just can't do that internally.
So Rick, can't we just use our
Yeah.
local friendly neighborhood MSP?
Yeah, that is really a good question here. And one of the little things they threw out there in December is that all the MSPs out there will need to be a level 2 certified. So that means they have to go through the same pain points that the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, has to go through.
Yeah, and so just for those who may not be familiar, a managed service provider or local IT shop, however you want to look at it, they may not be local, depends. But you may have outsourced IT. If you have any external folks managing or maintaining your network, then that would be considered an MSP. And one of the conditions, new conditions, is the MSPs are going to have to be fully certified too. So that was a shocker, and you can imagine a lot of them aren't going to be too thrilled about doing that if they only have 1 or 2 customers in the defense industry. So a similar kind of a, I don't know, business case needs to be made for the MSPs as well. So let's drill a little bit further into external enclave. So and we'll spend the remainder of our time on just what would you need to look for. Why would you even consider going external instead of internal? I think we've made the case that internal can be complicated. It's certainly not impossible, and it's the primary objective of the DoD is to get companies' networks secure. We're just looking at it with 2 feet on the ground, saying, yeah, but there's this thing called reality and budget, and how would you approach this if there's just no way you could get that done? So an external enclave, an online system that is already set up and secure, could be deployed quickly. You can just use it, move your documents in there and use it. And other benefits, we kind of refer to it as kind of the easy button, if you will. Because you can imagine we've just taken our entire network and all those headaches out of scope. And all of that is out of scope. Remember that last category of assets? Throw the whole thing under there, because we say, we're not going to even let CUI arrive or reside on our network. We're going to use a cloud system. But we got to be cautious in selecting a cloud system. So, Rick, what do we look for if
Yeah,
we're going
there's
to
some
go
really
look for one of these things?
Yeah, there's some really critical things that you need to look for. The first one that you want to make sure is that they are the cloud enclave, or the cloud provider is FedRAMP authorized or equivalent. Once again, that is a whole bunch of other requirements from the government that you have to meet in order to have that to be authorized as a FedRAMP moderate organization. So you want to check, where is my data residing? The second aspect of it is it has to be encrypted to at least a FIPS 140-2 validation. All data has to be encrypted. So you want to talk about, the encryption that they have. Is it at least meet that minimum requirement? And then the other part is the provider. Are they themselves certified, or do they plan to be certified to CMMC? That was one of the new things or updates that they came out with, that individuals in this arena supporting clients, they need themselves to be certified. You want to look at file sharing and incident response and data loss prevention. Those are all things that you want to talk about with that enclave solution, making sure that data can't leak out of that, making sure that it's solid there. And then just the overall that you are preventing CUI from being downloaded, because keep in mind, the moment you download something out of that enclave, your network becomes in scope. So what you were trying to prevent from happening when you download it to your system, if you're not careful, you're bringing your entire system in scope. So you want to be careful there. And you just want to keep those local devices, that local network, out of scope. And that's one of the
If this is your strategy, right? I mean, we're kind of presuming that here for the moment. For if you're going to go external, you got to prevent the internal access at all. So an example from our company is we provide a vault, a cloud-based enclave built for CUI and the contract information related to federal contracts as well. And the point is you can become certified, meet those requirements without a network overhaul. And that's really the value proposition, if you will. Now, so any cloud enclave can come out of the box with most of the requirements met, but there are still requirements that have to be implemented locally. So this is a typical kind of an arrangement. 82 of the 110 requirements are already set up and already being met. And then, of course, we're a consulting company, so we can help our clients with the rest of those requirements to help them get fully certified and ready to go when the time comes. So how does it work? Well, let's imagine, and I'll wrap up with this slide, I think. But let's imagine that you're sitting at your desk and you're involved in a team that is supporting a defense contractor, and you're going to work with CUI. Let's just presume that. And so you have a device in front of you. What you would initially do is move your CUI off your device, out of your network folders, out of your email, and you're transferring it into a virtual PC that's in a cloud called Core Vault, which our Core Vault is hosted in the AWS GovCloud environment. So we already check a lot of boxes by building the environment in AWS GovCloud. And that now operating a virtual PC through a remote desktop access, you'd be able to browse the internet securely with encryption. You'd be able to send email securely with encryption and do the things you would need to do in terms of workflow. And the system would back up. By the way, the backup is also in AWS GovCloud. So we keep it secure there. But that's one of the requirements to be asking about. And you can have other people in your organization with their own virtual PCs within the core vault environment. And then file sharing can be enabled so that, you can have a set of shared folders and such between that's not required, but if you have more than one user, you'd probably want to be able to share files. And this would require a separate email account. So that's a kind of a concession that has to be made as well, and a different domain. But that's a way of segregation. Again, we're thinking, at the top of this, that segregation. So then your CMMC scope is no longer in your environment, it's in our environment. And all the proof and evidence would have to come through that as well. And then for some of our clients, they still need to print for, manufacturing purposes or whatever. Well, in that case, a VPN has to be built and a direct connection to the printer, a non-networked printer, by the way, would be connected to a device that's in the VPN and connected to the vault. That's a use case we see. We also see where they have, high-end CAD machines that aren't going to work great in the cloud. So it's just the nature of it. So they want to run a local machine. Well, that machine would be segregated, split off, and then data would be transferred through a secure thumb drive, typically. And then same with manufacturing equipment. If you have manufacturing equipment where information has to flow. So this just illustrates how, the strategic option of using that third strategy we discussed of an external enclave would work. All right, Julie, I'm trying to be cognizant of time. I'm wrapping up here. Julia had seen this presentation before without all the pretty pictures, because we don't typically use a lot of pretty pictures, but I did today. It's part of our CMMC series. You guys are more than welcome to check out our website right up here. Well, I think Julia, we made this presentation available to you. Maybe you can make sure that everyone gets that. And we have our August webinar is tomorrow, and we're going to continue through the rest of the year to discuss CMMC. We've done this now 4 years in a row. Next year, we'll do another series. So please check it out and join us. So we're open to questions.
Yeah, so let's take a couple of questions, and if you're able to stay a few minutes after, we can wrap up the tech talk and then stay for some additional questions. Sure. So at this time, either feel free to unmute to ask your questions or put them in the chat. And Steve, you'll get the questions from the chat then, correct?
Correct. And you posted one question having to do with these enclaves, and maybe just talk briefly a little more detail about what kind of parameters or what kinds of thinking do you have around, can you use Dropbox? Can you share SharePoint, Google Drive? To what extent can you use these different technologies?
Great question. There are a lot of commercial cloud file sharing and other capabilities, systems out there. You've got to check them out, and you've got to ensure that they're FedRAMP certified, that they use the proper encryption, that they're maintaining FedRAMP compliancy themselves, that they're getting CMMC certified themselves, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't heard that those are great, easy options, but you got to get with the provider and get the proof, because the subcontractor or the supplier that's using the system has to prove compliance to the assessor. So you have to get the proof and have it in your possession. That doesn't mean the provider can't be on the call with the assessor and help you with some questions, but you've got to check them out and you've got to have the proof, or you're setting yourself up to get 319 out of 320 or less and paying for an assessment that isn't going to be successful, and then you get to pay for it again. So you got to check them out, Steve.
Okay, and so that basically that FedRAMP compliance and the encryption are two of the biggest key criteria for determining whether those enclaves would be compliant or not.
Well, and their plans for CMMC certification. I think that's another major one. Are they planning to get certified? Because you're going to have to prove to your assessor that your vendor is certified.
Okay.
in the sunset.
And Trent just posted a question. Are you aware of other countries outside the US that have similar requirements?
Not to this extent. I do know there are other national governments collaborating and defense agencies collaborating with the DoD on this. There are manufacturers in these supply chains that are located outside the US. That's another issue. But there's a lot of folks checking out whether this thing's going to be successful. But I'm not sure that there's a formal certification to this extent in another country. I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, I know
Okay.
Canada, Scott, Canada is pursuing this as well.
Okay.
How far along they are, I don't know. But I know that they are pursuing a similar certification.
Well, my own observation is that the world isn't getting any safer from a cybersecurity perspective. So
Exactly
no
right,
matter
Steve.
who you are, I imagine that these have to be in your thought process.
But
So
you're using
I know in the
you're using logic to explain what a government does. So just
of course.
I want you to understand what you just did.
So speaking of, I know in the defense community and contractor community, the golden question has been, when is this going to go live? When are we really going to have to comply with this? You mentioned that there have already been several rounds of delays.
Yeah.
What are you thinking might happen here?
Well, there are two regulations that have to be released by the federal government for this to work. One of them pertains to authorizing these requirements to go into defense contracts. There's a whole contractual part of this, and that has passed and is good to go. The CMMC regulation itself, which is the replacement to 7019, 7020, 7021, or at least 7021, I'm pretty sure. But it's an update to the DFARS regulation. That's in its final stages. They keep promising upon promises that it's going to be this year. I don't see any reason why it won't, because they've never gotten this far before in terms of approval. So we're expecting by the end of the year, we'll see these regulations out there. And then next year, it'll start to get rolled into, contracts over a 7-year period.